Imagine a nation so powerful it controlled 1/6 of the earth. A superpower that struck fear across the globe. Yet, without a single shot fired by an enemy, it collapsed from within. How does an empire this massive crumble so quickly? In this documentary, we uncover the true cause behind the fall of the Soviet Union. A downfall rooted not in war, but in its own flawed foundation. Stay tuned for the untold story of an empire's self-destruction. A few decades ago, there existed a nation known as the Soviet Union. This vast land, covering more than 1/6 of the Earth's total surface, was one of the world's two superpowers, standing alongside the United States. The mere mention of the Soviet Union evoked a sense of fear and awe, and leaders like Lenin, Stalin, and Gorbachev once ruled over it. Yet despite its immense power, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. On December 27, 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. Once a global superpower, the Soviet Union fell from within without any external military intervention. This unforeseen event marked the end of one of the most formidable empires in modern history. The Soviet Union's collapse was a major turning point in world affairs, and today we will explore the key factors that contributed to its demise, particularly its faltering economy. Even if we set aside the economic lens, it is still undeniable that economic weaknesses played a significant role in the downfall of the Soviet Union. Historically, economic issues have always been the Achilles heel of governments. Sometimes these problems lead to revolutions, and other times they accelerate the collapse of regimes. The Soviet Union was no exception. The Soviet Union's collapse didn't happen overnight. Years of accumulating problems, both small and large, gradually weakened the nation's foundation. Ultimately, these issues reached a critical point, bringing one of the world's greatest powers to its knees. But the primary cause of its collapse? The economy. Vladimir Lenin was the Soviet Union's first leader. As the country formed, Lenin stood at the height of his power. In the early days of the Soviet Union, Lenin famously remarked, "We have the right to be proud. We have been fortunate enough to establish the Soviet state and usher in a new era in the history of the world." His words captured the spirit of the time, as the Soviet Union did indeed signal a new global order. Upon assuming leadership, Lenin focused on political policy and was determined to nationalize the economy. Before long, the state controlled nearly everything in the Soviet Union. However, it quickly became evident that this approach wasn't sustainable. Consequently, Lenin had to scale back state ownership in certain sectors, introducing the concept known as the commanding heights. He realized that while the state needed control over key industries, it was impractical to directly control every aspect of the economy. During this period, more radical revolutionaries opposed Lenin's approach, arguing that the state should own everything, leaving no room for private ownership. Lenin, always the strategist, argued that full state ownership wasn't necessary. Instead, the government only needed to control the economy's most critical sectors, allowing private sector involvement in non-essential areas. Lenin's rhetoric towards his critics was far from gentle. He often called them fools, asserting that as long as the state had the ultimate power to decide who succeeded or failed, it didn't matter who nominally owned a business. control remained firmly in the hands of the government. The Soviet Union soon became a prime example of a centrally planned economy, one in which the government sought to control every facet of economic life. However, economists warned from the start that such a system couldn't last. As early as 2 years after the Soviet Union's creation, the famous economist Ludwig von Mises predicted its collapse. Later, Nobel Prize-winning economists like Milton Friedman echoed these concerns, foreseeing the Soviet system's eventual failure. Centralized economies, where the government controls all sectors, are prone to corruption. This was something economists clearly understood. In the 1950s, economist Robert Solow used data to show that the Soviet Union's growth was unsustainable. His models demonstrated that systems that consistently suppress both capital and labor were doomed to fail. Of course, the economists had no personal stakes in the Soviet Union's success or failure. Their analyses were purely academic, but they were often ignored. Lenin's leadership was tragically brief, lasting only 2 years. After his death, Joseph Stalin took over and implemented a series of 5-year plans. These plans prioritized the production of capital goods, such as military hardware, over consumer goods for the public. During Stalin's era, Soviet officials boasted about the nation's remarkable growth, flaunting it to the West. Industrial complexes thrived, and magazine covers featured images of workers enjoying leisure time. The Soviet narrative was clear. The West was in decline, while the Soviet system represented the future. Militarily, the Soviet Union was indeed a superpower. Its nuclear stockpile and military personnel nearly matched that of the United States. However, despite its military prowess, the Soviet Union was notably absent from global consumer markets. In industries like automobiles, household goods, and electronics, brands like Ford, Honda, and Toshiba dominated, but there were no Soviet equivalents. The Soviets attempted to produce cars, launching models like the Lada. But while their missile systems were some of the most advanced in the world, they struggled to produce basic consumer goods. How could a nation with such vast resources and intellectual capital fail to produce a reliable car? The answer lies in the nature of command economies under authoritarian regimes. Innovation and efficiency were stifled, as economic decisions were driven by political agendas rather than market needs. In systems like the Soviet Union's, the economy primarily serves the political goals of the ruling elite. Rather than addressing the population's daily needs, resources were funneled into projects that bolstered the government's control. A prime example of this was the Soviet Union's massive investment in space exploration. While its citizens struggled to meet basic needs, Soviet car factories, for instance, didn't serve the public interest, but were instead used to benefit those loyal to the regime. The Soviets could build advanced missiles, but they couldn't produce a standard, reliable car. Furthermore, the Soviet economy became increasingly reliant on oil production. This revenue helped sustain the nation's economy until World War II. Economies dependent on oil are highly vulnerable to shocks. Beyond its economic failures, the Soviet Union made a grave mistake in its suppression of intellectuals and the media. Dissenters were sent to prison camps or executed. The notorious KGB had a program designed to eliminate intellectuals without physically harming them. Instead, the KGB subtly infiltrated their lives, creating problems that led to mental and emotional breakdowns. Many were driven to madness, and some even committed suicide. Another factor in the Soviet Union's collapse was its mismanagement of pension funds. Early on, the government lowered the retirement age and increased pensions without considering long-term sustainability. By 1985, 5 years before the collapse, the number of retirees had surpassed the number of workers. The pension funds were effectively bankrupt, but the government refused to reform. Soviet leaders were in denial about the severity of these issues. One story illustrates this perfectly. During a trip abroad, an economist harshly criticized Soviet policies. The head of the Soviet economic delegation calmly responded, "Why are you telling us this? We already know these things." When asked why they hadn't acted to fix the problems, the Soviet official replied, "What you see as a problem, we do not." This attitude epitomized the Soviet Union's downfall. In its effort to maintain power, the government made economic commitments that ultimately led to its collapse. As Brezhnev took power, he made some attempts at reform, which led to brief economic improvements. However, the ill-fated decision to invade Afghanistan in the late 1970s drained the Soviet economy. The war, lasting nearly a decade, resulted in severe economic strain and growing discontent among the people. By the time Gorbachev took power, it was too late. Reforms were attempted, but the system was beyond saving. The collapse of the Soviet Union serves as a cautionary tale for the world. Power that ignores the needs of its people is unsustainable. In the end, the Soviet Union became a lesson in how economic mismanagement can lead even the greatest of empires to its downfall.
В силу сложившейся ситуации с образованием Содружества независимых государств я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful and insightful, make sure to subscribe to Empower Assets and hit the notification bell so you never miss our future content. Give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We've got plenty more valuable content coming your way. Until next time, keep working on your financial growth and personal development.